My name is John Lobell. I teach at Pratt Institute. I blog at creativitydiscourse.com. I do movie reviews from a mythological point of view at cinemadiscourse.com, and you can reach me at johnlobell@mac.com. And our talk today is about how to build a human being through art. So, no, not that kind of building a human being, but, well, so first we need to know what kind of human being we want to build. And might it be ancient Greek? And here we have an individual subject to fate. In the Middle East, the emphasis is not on the individual, but on society, and we are dictated to do as above, so below. In India, the point is to identify not with this material world, but with the infinite, and in China, to experience oneself as part of a flow of nature. And I have figures in all these except the Chinese one, and there are figures in there, but they blend in with the landscape. In the West, we have a notion of the individual with an inner moral compass. Let's see how we'll build one. Well, let's begin with a soul. And here we have Cimabue in the Middle Ages. And this is a Madonna and Child. And there's no real character in these figures. They're not individual people. The individual is not important. It's one's eternal soul that's important. They're not really in a physical space, but in a gold glowing background, in a spiritual space. And a few hundred years later, with Raphael, we have, again, a Madonna and Child, a mother and child. And here they're fleshed out. They're human beings. Now, there doesn't seem to be a lot going on in the face of Mary. So we've got to build that in as we go. But at least we've got a fleshed out human being. We've built a body. And so from Vesalius, his book goes from the standing, complete human being, and then he peels off the muscles so that we can see how it's built. But here I put them in the other order, building up to a human being. So there's a sense that we are a physical, biological, anatomical creature, as well as having a soul. And now here we have a Renaissance painting, Botticelli's Birth of Venus, and here we see a couple things. One is the way the figures dominate the landscape. So this is humanist. Human beings are more important than the landscape, contrary to that Chinese depiction. And this is a pagan goddess, not a Christian figure. So Venus is a Roman, Greek goddess of love. And so we're reaching back into the Greek and Roman era because it's a humanist era, because of the learning, the science, the appreciation of the human being. And so we want to bring that in and mold that into the human being that we're building in Western culture. We also observe that there's a naked woman here. So again, an appreciation of anatomy, that we are a body as well as a soul. Now, this is what's called a cartoon by Leonardo da Vinci, a diagram that is going to be occupied by figures. It's an adoration of the Magi. And so these perspective lines create a space. The space is the stage that we occupy, giving us a potential for action. So here in Da Vinci's Mona Lisa, we have the human being come forward with some sense of an interiority to the self, dominating a landscape. And here's another Leonardo da Vinci, again, mother and child, Mary and Jesus with Anne, Mary's mother, and they are also fleshed out human beings in a natural landscape. So we're very interested in the landscape. Again, this stage that is the potential for the action of our lives. And our engagement with the physical world can even involve understanding it and ultimately conquering it. Perhaps eventually with flying machines, as we see in the many explorations of flying machines that Leonardo does. Now, Leonardo's younger colleague, Michelangelo, this is one of his first major sculptures, and it's the Pietà, Mary with the dead Christ. A lot of interesting things here. Mary is depicted as the teenager she was when she gave birth to Christ, rather than as an older woman. But what's of interest here is that the sculpture was put out in public, and the public, amazed by it, were attributing it to another sculptor. And in anger, Michelangelo went out at night and carved, I, Michelangelo, sculpted this across the sash across her breast. So we now have the ego of the artist. We have an individual, we know who they are. It's now 500 years later, we still know who these people are, even down to daily what they did in their lives and their great works. This is Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel ceiling, and let's just zoom in on one of the panels. This is God reaching out to touch Adam's finger, and the electric shock of life, of soul, is going to animate him. But let's look at something else. Look at God. Look at those flowing robes in his background and the churning angels with him. What does that figure of that red robe look like? Well, for hundreds of years people looked at it, didn't notice, but suddenly somebody noticed. It's a section of a human brain. What's Michelangelo saying? That God is a function of the human mind. He would never dare say that out loud, perhaps not even to himself. But these artists were very anatomically aware, as we can see by looking at all these muscles, and he knew what a brain looked like. And so, very interesting notion here. This is one of the Sibyls on the ceiling, and we see the self having a soul and being built up as an anatomy as well. Now, this is Michelangelo's most important sculpture, the David, and very similar to Greek sculpture. This is a Roman copy of a Greek sculpture. Michelangelo would have been familiar with this kind of sculpture, and we see similarities, but then there's a difference. When we look in at the face of the Greek sculpture, it's blank. It's an ideal human face. But the David has a character, and he's involved in something, like he's got to go up against up against Goliath. And so in preparation, you see him in thought. His brow is furrowed. His eyes are intense. There's a mind in there. Now, just for a moment, let's contrast that with one of the great Buddhist sculptures, an Indonesian Pajma Paramita, goddess of wisdom, or goddess of transcendent wisdom, and male, female, eyes open, eyes closed, in concentrated thought, in meditative abandonment of thought. So two very different worlds in the East and the West, and in another talk we can look at how to build an Eastern human being as opposed to a Western one. Here we have the third in the triumvirate of the great High Renaissance artists, Raphael, his painting or mural, School of Athens. Our figures are set not in Athens, because the Athenians didn't make any vaults like that. They're in the unfinished nave of St. Peter's Cathedral, which is under construction at the time. Our central figures are on our left is Plato, pointing up, indicating his philosophy of ideal forms, and on our right is Aristotle, pointing forward, indicating his philosophy of our material world. And all the figures deployed around them are contemporary to the time or ancient figures representing the full range of what was a complete human being, of education, science, art, mathematics, philosophy, theology. And so all these parts of ourselves are indicated in all these figures. Now, we've now built from a soul to a body, a space or stage in nature on which to act, and then an interior psychology or character, and a full range of disciplines, knowledges, arts that inform a human being, but we haven't yet achieved emotionality. And so dynamic emotion, action and dynamic emotion comes with the Baroque. The great Baroque painter is Caravaggio. Here is his Supper at Emmaus. Christ has reappeared among several of the disciples 3 days later after having been entombed. Our disciple on the left is launching out of his chair. What? We're in a moment of startled action. Our figure on the right is reaching out to us, pulling us in. Here, pointing with his right hand. Here's the guy. Here he is, reaching with his left hand to pull us into the action. So, dynamic emotionality. And we also get from Caravaggio eroticism. And so, with the Baroque, there's an entire science of the emotions. All different kinds and levels are studied. And on the left is an early Renaissance painting of the Annunciation, when the angel Gabriel comes to Mary and tells her that she's pregnant with the child of God. Not much reaction on Mary's part. Static. The Renaissance is static. The Baroque is dynamic, explosive. Here is the ascension of Mary. At her death, she goes up to heaven. Heavenly host appears to welcome her. Explosive light, dynamic figures, rich in action. And so this dynamic emotional action is now added to our layers of making a human being. Here we have this action on the right in Bernini's David, and whereas Michelangelo on the left has David in repose, static before the encounter with Goliath, on the right Bernini has him in the midst of action. And now another Bernini sculpture, the Exetery of San Teresa. San Teresa is an extremely interesting figure. Beautiful book, The Interior Castle. Here she describes a dream in which an angel pierced her heart with a flaming golden arrow, and she wrote, "The pain was so great that I screamed aloud, but at the same time I felt such infinite sweetness that I wished the pain to last forever." So here in religious orgasm, the figure is bathed with light in these gilded rays of sun. And if we look at the figure on the right, we see it's like a stage set. And not only that, to the far right of our figure on the right, we can just make out there's a box, a theatrical box. And there's Mr. and Mrs. Cornaro, who donated the money for this. And they are the audience for this erotic religious experience of San Teresa, representing us in engagement with the emotional activity. Now, going back to Leonardo, on the left we have a portrait of a young woman by Leonardo and kind of blank behind the eyes. Contrast this with a Baroque portrait by Rembrandt on the right, here in a self-portrait, and we see molded into the folds of the skin of his face, built up with his thick brushstrokes, are the experiences of his life, the triumphs and joys, the sadnesses, the sorrows, the loss of his wife, the loss of his son, his bankruptcy. Eventually his guild forbids him to sell paintings. So over the course of his life, in a series of self-portraits, we round out a complete human being now, a soul, a body, a space within which to act, an interior character, and then emotional depth. Still more to add. With the Rococo, we have frivolity, joy of life. So this is Fragonard, the swing. A young couple are out in a park. A servant is swinging a young lady on her swing. She is kicking off her slipper and kicking up her dress so that her lover can look up her dress. So we're in erotic frivolity, the sort of powder puff quality of the clouds and the leaves, making joy. Around the same time in England, we're a little more serious. So maybe that's why the English were first to the Industrial Revolution. Here we are, Joseph Wright of Derby, a philosopher giving a lecture at the orrery. Now, an orrery is a model of the solar system. And there's this fascination with Newton and Newton's laws, understanding the orbits of the planets, and then these laws of motion can become applicable here on Earth for trajectories of cannonballs, for machines. And here are young children illuminated, their faces illuminated by the sun at the center of our model of the solar system. An orrery is a model of the solar system. And we know, of course, we're confident that these children will grow up to be scientists. So we're in a period of turmoil, of change. Look at the tension between that orrery and the swing, of a kind of playing out of the old painterly tradition and a new scientific tradition. And at this point of tension, there are two directions that one might take. The first one is to look back, to say, look, we're in trouble now, things are in turmoil because we have deviated from the firm rules of the past. We should go back to those rules. That's called neoclassicism. The great neoclassical painter is Jean-Louis David. And here his Oath of the Horatii are well-muscled young Roman sons taking an oath to the father that they will seek vengeance. Their wives saying, oh boy, they're all going to die. But civic virtue, the values of classical Rome, that's looking backwards. How do you look forward? Where do you look? The future's not here yet. Well, you can look inward. And so Caspar David Friedrich does a series of paintings called Romanticism, or a style called Romanticism. And here is Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog. We can be assured this is a young poet. And his heart is filled with tensions and longings. The aesthetic here is called the Sublime. And the Sublime is the experience of inner emotional feelings that are beyond any ability of psychology or science to explain them, and then forces of nature that are beyond any ability of science to explain or control. And so our young poet here, hiking across the mountains, looking down into the fog. Here we have another Friedrich painting, the power of nature demonstrated by these ice floes smashing a ship. Here is an abbey in ruins, and so the past can reverberate into us and evoke this sublime feeling. And this romanticism we experience also in Turner, great paintings of storms, shipwrecks, sunrises, with the burning Houses of Parliament. the smoke putting out lots of rich light at sunrise. So this dynamic quality of nature that transcends our ability to even understand it. So now we've added on yet another layer of our awe before the power of nature. We're a creature that experiences awe as well as what we have described before. And then through the 1800s, you have the development of the modern world, from the telegraph to the Morse code, the first transatlantic cable, the telephone, the radio is under development. And so an electronic net, or electrical net, we should say, is encircling the globe. What is our experience of that? We hold a telephone to our ear, and our neurons, by way of electric extensions, extend out of our skull through the telephone, telegraph, radio networks and waves around the globe, producing a state of anxiety. So here we have Edward Munch's The Scream, and we've added yet another layer to our human being, the sense of anxiety. Now, on the left is an orrery. I described that before. This is a very scaled model of a solar system. It just represents the sun, which is the bronze ball in the center, and the earth. And we can see the tilt of the earth, and we turn the crank, the earth will go around the sun. We can see how the tilt will generate the seasons. We could add a moon to this. Some of them include all the planets. And it's a very mechanistic view of the universe, or the stage on which we exist. On the right is an electrical field. This is a magnet. On top of the magnet, you put a piece of paper, and then you sprinkle iron filings onto that paper, and they will jump into a pattern that depicts the magnetic field around the magnet. So these magnetic fields are everywhere, all around us. We're made up of them. Light is an electromagnetic field. And so a totally different notion of the world that we live in comes about. And we get in Monet's Impressionism here, Rouen Cathedral. Monet makes a couple dozen paintings of it, each different because each is painted in a different quality of light. So the stone cathedral is lost to us. We don't experience the stone. We experience the light coming from it to our eyes. And the light changes in sunrise, sunset, foggy day, clear day, rainy day. The light is always different, and Monet captures that light. And so we are now interplaying with this world of electromagnetic forces, most famously in Vincent van Gogh's The Starry Night. And here we have the stars in the sky, each a little galaxy swirling with energy. We don't have objects, we have nodes in the electromagnetic field. The cypress tree is flames looking the sky. The landscape is churning. And less famously, but just as evocatively, one of Van Gogh's several paintings of wheat fields, where the wheat is almost like flames or churning water. Everything is animated. Everything is alive. He experienced this religious, living, vibrant quality to the world, just like our electric fields, and they interact with us. We are now not standing outside as objective observers of a material world. We are interrelated and interacting with it. Now, with the opening of the 20th century, a group of artists is gathered in Paris, and they're vying for position, who's going to be the leader of the pack, and for an understanding and depicting of the 20th century. And Matisse makes a move. And in The Joy of Life, huge painting, when you make a painting that big, it's announcing that it's of major importance. He shows these figures frolicking in a landscape, making out, and so life is joyous. the world is receptive to us. And the moment he does that, Pablo Picasso, young artist, very quiet, watching, sees his opportunity and makes his move. And also in a large painting, Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, Picasso depicts these prostitutes as fierce, jagged figures with primitive masks, aggressive sexuality in a jagged background, indicative of the horrors of the 20th century that are to unfold. Picasso rips open a vein of the Victorian comfortable culture and sees these primitive hostile forces inside that are about to unfold. And then, along with Braque, Picasso develops Cubism, and this is a portrait of Vallard, an art dealer, and Vallard is shattered as though reflected in a broken or shattered mirror. We are no longer have a fixed point of view. We're in motion around the figure is disintegrated, and we are integral in motion with the figure. And so all that human being that we have built up for the past several hundred years is beginning to come apart. Time is no longer, space is gone, time is no longer uniform, but is bent to our subjective experience here in Salvador Dali's Persistence of Memory, The Melting Watches, and physicist and astronomer Sir James Jeans in England writes, "The universe begins to look more like a great thought than a great machine. Mind no longer appears to be an accidental intruder into the realm of matter. We ought rather hail it as the creator and governor of the realm of matter." So with Einstein's relativity, with quantum theory, we have entered into a new world. And while 1905, 1907, Matisse and Picasso are battling it out to define the 20th century, just 10 years later, in a work called The Fountain, Duchamp is defining the 21st century. So Marcel Duchamp in 1917 was on the board of a gallery in New York called the Society of Independent Artists. And in response to the galleries, particularly in Europe, that keep turning away this radical new modern art, they announced they would have an exhibit and they would accept all submissions. So Duchamp goes off to a plumbing supply, buys a men's room urinal, signs it R. Mutt, 1917, the year, and anonymously submits it to the gallery. Now what? They can't show this thing. It's not art. On the other hand, they said they'd show anything. So they made a real calculated, cowardly move. They put it in the exhibit, but behind a curtain, hoping no one would notice it. Bad move for a gallery claiming to be progressive, as the urinal was to become one of the most important works in the history of modern art. Duchamp then announced that it was his and resigned from the gallery, as did several prominent members, and the gallery then compounded their misfortunes by losing the urinal. So what is Duchamp up to here? What was he doing? Well, can't define art here, but let's just start with a little bit of a beginning. And we'll say an artist has an intention, an idea. They want to convey an insight about our time or about the human condition. So they create something, usually requiring craft and an aesthetic sense. Although we now know not always requiring craft or an aesthetic sense. And they place the creation where an audience can encounter it in a gallery, on a stage, between the covers of a book, in a concert hall. Now, an audience encounters the work, sometimes with acceptance, sometimes with consternation. And now we have the work, the initial response of the audience, subsequent responses of that audience, responses of subsequent audiences, and then as the work enters the canon of its time, there's the ongoing evaluation by critics and historians, and all of this reverberates and interacts through the decades and centuries. Duchamp's point was that art is not just the something usually requiring craft or an aesthetic sense, but this entire process. And we, who used to be the outside objective observers, are fully engaged in this process. Now, what does this mean and how does this unfold over the next 100 years? That'll have to be for future talks.